Thank you very much, Sumbella. And once again, many thanks to all of you who've joined us from literally all over the world. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. Can I just reiterate what Sumbella said about the chat box? Please use the chat box to respond to anything that I ask you to do. And if you have specific questions which you'd like to be answered when we have the Q&A at the end, you can put those in the Q&A box. I know many of you have questions about your certificates and about previous webinars. Please don't use the chat box for asking those questions. We'll deal with all of that once the webinar is over. So please leave the chat box free for communicating with me during the activities which we have during the webinar itself. Okay, so to begin with, you may notice that on the screen now, underneath the title of the webinar, you've got my name, but also my friend and colleague, Matt Ellman, who works for Cambridge University Press based in Cambridge. Unfortunately, Matt is unable to be with us due to sickness. He was unable to deliver his webinar on Monday morning, and he's unable to be with us here this morning as well. So let's all hope that Matt gets better very soon. Just very quickly, for those of you who don't know me, my name's Peter Lucantoni. That's an Italian surname. My dad was Italian, my mum is English, but I was born in the UK, I was educated there, and I've been working in English language teaching for over 40 years in various roles. I now work as the Educational Services Manager for Professional Learning and Development for Cambridge University Press, and I've also got a background with Cambridge CELTA, and Delta, and also aspects of the assessment. Okay, so what we're going to do this morning is cover 4 areas and also make a conclusion. And the 4 areas I want to talk about are this move from teaching learners into teacher learning, the importance of contexts. We're going to have a look at what effective teachers do, and end up by having a look at what teacher learning actually is and what it involves. So first of all then, from teaching learners to teacher learning. So what we're talking about here is, those of you in the room now, those of you who are involved in this webinar, we've probably got teachers with an enormous amount of experience, maybe 5 years, maybe 10, maybe 15, maybe 20 years, maybe some even more than that. And you've probably got experience working in different contexts, working with different age groups, teaching general English, teaching business English, a whole spectrum of different amounts of experience. And it's possible that some of you may now be in a position where you're thinking, okay, I've spent a lot of time teaching learners. Now I need to know more about myself and teacher learning, and maybe also it's possible for teachers to pass on their knowledge and skills to other learners. So this is basically what we're going to be talking about today. How do we move from a situation where we have an enormous amount of skills and experience? How can we move into a different role where we deliver, or we transfer, if you like, all of that knowledge and skills to other teachers? So I want to start with a photograph of my dear friend and colleague who's not with us this morning. This is Matt Ellman, and something that Matt said to me in a conversation 5 or 6 months ago, when we started work on a joint project, and he said this, and I'll just leave you to read that for a few seconds. So the point that Matt is making here is that just because you know a language, it doesn't mean necessarily that that knowledge transfers into being able to teach it effectively. And in the same way, just because you know how to teach, just because you have an enormous amount of knowledge about teaching, an enormous amount of experience in everything that's required to teach, that doesn't necessarily mean that you would be able to train other people to teach effectively. And it was this thought, this idea, this discussion with Matt, which brought our two heads together. And we've now embarked on a project which is called From Teaching Learners to Teacher Learning. And we've said in our project, we've said this, that even if there are opportunities to start training, even if these opportunities are actually available, the opportunities for learning how to become a trainer are often very limited. And in certain contexts, they may actually be non-existent. And it's interesting because during these very difficult times, of course, the internet is buzzing, and social media platforms such as LinkedIn and Facebook are buzzing. They're buzzing with looking ahead as well as looking at the now. And I'm particularly interested in all the advertisements I'm seeing for job opportunities, and in particular for the MENA region, which is the region where I actually work in. And I've noticed an enormous number of work opportunities for teachers. And I'm investigating further and further, but I haven't yet seen a single job opportunity for a trainer. So even though there may be contexts in which trainers are actually required, learning how to become a trainer, or indeed to obtain a job as a trainer, are probably pretty much non-existent. And going on from this point that Matt and I have made, even if there is an opportunity to become a trainer, it may be that people, and maybe some of you who are with us today, you've found that the opportunity is there, but actually the task is a lot more daunting, a lot more challenging than you actually anticipated, or possibly the guidance that you're receiving is not sufficient. So yes, the opportunity may be there, but actually it's not what you were expecting, and you're not getting the support. So let's remember that while teachers need support, and they certainly need guidance throughout their careers, it's also true of people who move into a training role or a training capacity. They also need guidance and support from their peers and colleagues. So if we're going to move from teaching learners into teacher learning, there must surely be things which are the same. There must surely be things which we can transfer from one context to another. And of course, at the same time, there are things which are going to be different. So 2 questions, and you do not need to write anything in the chat box, not yet. I just want you to think. But my 2 questions are, when we're thinking about moving from teaching learners into teacher learning, what's the same and what's different? So again, please, you don't need to write anything in the chat box, but just reflect on that for 30 seconds or so. And then I'm going to give you a task. Okay, so you're probably reflecting and thinking that yes, there are some things that happen in the classroom which can be moved into a training context, and there are other things which are different between the two. So I'm going to show you now 6 statements, and I want you to read them and have a think about them. You can this time, if you want, write something in the chat box, but we currently have, let me see, 2,500 people listening in on this webinar, so it's going to be impossible to monitor what you're saying in the chat box. But if you feel you want to write something, then please do. So I'm going to show you 6 statements, and I just want you to think about them, reflect on them. And I've put at the bottom of the screen here in italics, there are no right or wrong thoughts to the 6 statements. Everybody's going to have a different perspective on what the 6 statements say. So here's number 1. As I said, please, you do not need to write anything. This is really about reflection and thinking. What are your thoughts? What's your perspective on these things? So here's the first one. I need to have the same knowledge about learning when I teach students in a classroom and when I teach teachers in a training context? Just have a think about that. Okay, I'm just looking at a couple of the comments. As I said, you really do not need to write anything, but it's interesting that we've got both extremes. We've got some people saying absolutely yes, and others saying absolutely no, and that's fine because, as I said, there's no right or wrong answer to this. But what we do need to do is to think a little bit more carefully about what the statement is saying. The statement is saying that I need, as a trainer or as a teacher, to have the same knowledge about learning when I teach students and when I teach teachers. So you as the person who's up there at the front disseminating, do you need to have the same knowledge about learning when you teach students and when you teach teachers? I don't think there's a yes or a no or a right or a wrong here. I think it's more about the breadth and the depth of the knowledge about learning that you need to have. So when you move into teaching teachers, you need to have a much broader and deeper knowledge about what goes on in the learning process. If your experience as a teacher has been very much with teaching children, then you have a very specific knowledge set about learning. But when you move into teaching teachers, you may be having to respond to questions about many different teaching contexts. So I don't think there's a yes or a no, a right or a wrong here. But I do think, and you'll probably hear me say this several times during the webinar, that an effective trainer, somebody who's teaching teachers, needs to have breadth and depth of knowledge. Okay, my second statement then. The skills I need to plan a lesson for learners are quite similar to those that I need to plan a session for teachers. So again, I'll give you 20 seconds or so to have a think. Please, you don't need to write anything in the text box. I can see a couple of you saying you can't hear. I suggest you turn up your volume because mine is fine, I think, for most people. Okay, and as with the first statement, we've got both extremes. A lot of people are saying no way, and others are saying absolutely true, which is fine. You know, we don't have to agree, and there are no rights or wrongs to these statements. But let's have a look at it again. The skills I need to plan a lesson for learners are quite similar to those I need to plan a session for teachers. And again, I think there will be things which are similar. There are aspects of a lesson plan which can be transferred over into a session plan for training teachers, aims, objectives, resources, timing, all of those types of things are probably going to be exactly the same. But there are definitely going to be things which are different when we're training teachers, and we'll be coming back to those things as we move through this webinar. Okay, the third statement I want to bring to your attention, and again, you don't need to write anything in the chat box, just reflect, just think. The skills I need to manage learners in classes are very similar to the skills I need to manage teachers in class. Again, I'll give you about 20 seconds, have a think. And again, we've got the whole spectrum. We've got no, absolutely not. We've got yes, absolutely yes. And we've got maybes as well. Please don't worry. There's no right or wrong answer, but it's something that we need to think about. Managing learners and managing teachers. By definition, teachers are going to be adults. Not all learners are adults. Many are school children. Maybe you're teaching kindergarten. So there may be some similarities in how you manage those different types of learners, but I think there's probably going to be many differences as well. How do you manage a class of 3, 4, 5, 6, 7-year-olds? Is it really the same as the way that you manage a group of adults? You know, we don't need to answer that, but we do need to think about it. So look at the statement again. The skills I need to manage learners in class are very similar to the skills I need to manage teachers in class. I think there are similarities, but I also think that there are going to be differences. And of course, it depends very much on who it is that's actually in front of you. So yes, there are similarities, but I think there are going to be differences as well. Okay, my fourth statement for you to think about. I should avoid doing language games with teachers in class. They are adults, and so games are too childish for them. So I'll give you about 20 seconds. Have a think about that one. Okay, and I think for this one, we seem to have more consensus, more agreement between, I think most people are saying, no, that's not true. We shouldn't avoid using language games. We can use language games in the classroom. Most of you are disagreeing with the statement, and I think I would tend to disagree, but again, there's no right or wrong answer. What we need to do is think about the statement and reflect on it. Of course, hopefully what's the conclusion you're coming to is that of course we can use language games in the classroom, but it's how we use them which is going to be different. We don't want a training session which is just 60 minutes of teachers doing language games. What we need to do is to expose the teachers to the language games and then to get the teachers to reflect on the language game. Indeed, it's not even necessary for teachers to complete a particular language game. What they need to do is have an exposure to it, to understand how it works, and then to think about how they could possibly transfer that into their own classroom. So games are not childish, and yes, of course, we can use them in a training context. The important thing is how we get our teachers to analyze the language game, how we get them to reflect on the language game, and how we get them to think about the transference of that language game into their own teaching and learning context. Okay, two more statements for you. Here's number 5. It's quite a long one, this one, so I'll give you a bit more time to think about it. If I do an activity with teachers in class, they may learn different things from it. Some may learn new language, some a new way of teaching language, and some may learn about an activity type which is new for them. So there are 3 parts to this particular statement, and I'll give you about 30 seconds to have a think about that one. Okay, and I think for this particular one, I can see lots of people saying yes, 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 agree, agree, agree. I think this is a less contentious statement. I think it's very true, and as somebody who's teaching teachers, somebody who's leading teachers, I think we have to understand that unlike students, teachers will bring in a very, very broad variety of different skills and knowledge and experience. We talk very often, don't we, about mixed ability classes of students having different amounts of skill. But I think when we're teaching teachers, yes, they will have differences between them, but I think the differences are far greater. And it may be that some learn new language, it may be some learn a new way of teaching language, and others may learn about an activity type. Maybe it's something which is completely new for them. And of course, there are others who may learn 2 of those particular things. Okay, so the final statement I want you to have a think about is this one. As a teacher, I need mainly to know what works in class. As a trainer, I need to know what works and to be able to explain why to teachers when necessary. Okay, 20 seconds, have a reflection on that. And again, this is not such a contentious one, and I think everybody is agreeing that as a trainer, we really do need to know what works. But probably much more importantly is to be able to explain why, what's the rationale behind it. As teachers, we know that this works with our students, but as a trainer, we need to be able to explain why something is useful to use in the classroom. I know in my own experience, and I'm sure that Matt and those of you who are trainers already would agree, that teachers can be sometimes, and don't take this personally, but teachers can sometimes be a little bit negative about anything that's new, maybe not prepared to take the risk of trying something new. And I think this is where the role of the trainer as somebody who can explain why something is worthwhile doing becomes really so important. All right, so we've had a look at what the similarities and differences are between teaching learners and teacher learning. So I want to move now into the second part of this talk, which is about context. And by context, we mean the situation, if you like, even the place within which we're doing our teaching and indeed our training. So I want to introduce you to this gentleman over here on the right. He looks familiar to me. And something which I wrote some years back now is this, and I'll just put it on the screen for you to have a look at. So context, extremely important. And we know that every teaching and learning situation is going to be different. And we can never fully understand every single teaching context. Even if you have the same teaching context from a physical perspective, you know, in other words, the same classroom in the same building every day, or even you know, the same classroom on the same day, you know that moving from one day to the next or from 1 hour to the next, things are going to change. And what worked with one class at one time may not work with another class at a different time. And of course, this is where the real challenge lays for us when we become trainers. How on earth can we possibly prepare teachers for this great variety that they're going to come across in their teaching? And Richards and Farrell say that this is one of the most important things in learning how to teach. It's this understanding what the characteristics are of a particular teaching context and how they shape the nature of teaching and learning. So we can move students, or we can move learning, if you prefer, from one context to another, and that will completely change the shape of how that teaching and learning actually go ahead. So here's a little task for you from the project that Matt and I are currently working on. It's one of the tasks from the book that we're putting together. And I hope you can see on the screen two teaching contexts, A on the left and B on the right. And there are 3 questions underneath it. And I'd like you, again, there's no point in putting it in the chat box because we can't monitor nearly 3,000 people, but really just to start having a think about it. The first question is, what might be the main affordances? That means the positives and the limitations of each context. And then questions 2 and 3, what can teacher A do that teacher B can't, and vice versa? Now, the 2 teaching contexts are very different, but please can you understand that we're not saying that one is good and one is bad, one is right and one is wrong. That's not the point. Our job is not to consider teaching situations from the perspective of right or wrong or good and bad. It would be unreasonable to be doing that. What our job is to look at contexts and support teachers in how they can deal with those contexts in an effective manner. So I'm just going to give you 30 seconds or so. As I say, we can't monitor all of your comments, but I'll give you a little bit of feedback in 30 seconds or so. Okay, I can see quite a few people are saying that B is more effective, B is better. Um, okay, possibly, but I think as a trainer, you can't say that, because how about a teacher who is teacher A? It wouldn't be fair, would it, to say to teacher A, yeah, that's okay, but it would be much better if you were teacher B. That doesn't help, that doesn't support. We need to find positives and limitations in both of these particular teaching contexts. So I can see lots of things coming up in the text box, in the chat box. Some nice positive comments about A, that in A, the teacher is able to have eye contact with all of the students. The teacher in A is able to focus on all of the students at the same time. These are all very, very good things. Teacher B, of course, there are opportunities for group work and close monitoring by the teacher. Lots and lots of nice ideas coming in. I think it's important as we move through this talk this morning that we understand that the trainer's job is never to say that a particular situation, a particular context is right or wrong or better or worse. What we need to always be doing is looking at where the teacher is, what the teacher is being confronted with, and support the teacher in that particular context. We should never say to a teacher, it would be better if you were doing this, when that is actually not possible. Okay, so what then are the characteristics of a teaching context, and are they always the same? I think the answer to the second part is, of course, no, they're not. The characteristics of a teaching context are not always the same. Some things may be the same, but generally speaking, most things are actually going to be different. And it's these differences, as well as the similarities, but probably more it's the differences, which we need to consider. So this time I would like you to put some things in the chat box, just for about 30 seconds. I want you to think about the characteristics that a teacher can actually control. So what are the characteristics of a teaching context that a teacher can control? So just write some things in the chat box. I can see knowledge, material, classroom setting, teacher talking time, the resources. Okay, great, good, lovely. I think, again, depending on where you are and who you are, there are going to be differences. And it's these differences which probably are going to do more to shape our roles as teachers and indeed as trainers. I want to show you quite a long quote, I'm afraid, from Childs, but just have a look at what Childs says about context. So Childs is saying it's actually impossible for any teacher education, any type of professional learning and development, any type of training support that you're getting, it's impossible to prepare a teacher to be ready to teach in every single context. But what it can do is get teachers to understand that context is incredibly important. It's a powerful mediator that can shape or be shaped by how they conceptualize teaching. And so it's therefore incumbent, it's therefore essential for professional development programs to ensure that teachers leave with this understanding. And I'm sure many of you in the room now have done CELTA or Delta or equivalent teacher training courses. Maybe you left your home country, maybe you went to the UK, or maybe Istanbul in Turkey or Cairo in Egypt, and you did your courses there. And it's highly likely that you were not really put in a position that you see when you go back home is very, very different from the teaching that you have to do. Experienced, and indeed when I did my own equivalent of CELTA many, many years ago, I was teaching in London. I seem to remember having 12 or 14 students from different European countries, all teaching, all speaking different languages. So it was very much a multilingual context. But then moving abroad in parts of Europe and the Middle East, of course, the teaching context was completely different. I had monolingual classes and never less than 20 or 30 students in the classroom. So the point that Charles is making is that it's very difficult to know what context teachers will be moving into after they've completed their training. So I just want to pick up on one of the things that Charles said, is that teachers need to understand that context is a powerful mediator that can shape or be shaped by how they conceptualize teaching. So the question for us then is how can we actually do this? How can we, the trainers, or those of you who want to become trainers, how can you show teachers how important context is? And indeed, there are obviously going to be problems in actually doing this. And going back to the example that I just gave, as trainers, if we're training teachers on something like a CELTA course or the equivalent, it's the main problem that we face is that we have no clue, we have no idea about where the teachers are going to actually be doing their teaching. Now, I'm actually very lucky because most of the training that I do nowadays, and indeed the training that Matt does, we're going to specific places, to specific universities or schools, and we have a very, very good idea of the context. We know the teachers, we know the course materials, we know how many students there are in a class, we know the times of the lessons, we know what technology is available, and so on and so forth. By having all of that knowledge, when a trainer has all of that knowledge, it's much easier for the trainer to help the teacher to understand how important context is and how context can shape what goes on in the teaching and the learning context. But a trainer going into a particular place and doing training for a short amount of time and then leaving, it's very difficult for that trainer to have a really good, clear understanding of what the context is. Okay, so that brings me on to the third thing that I want to talk about today, and that's what effective teachers actually do. Because if we can understand what a teacher does, or what an effective teacher does, then that, of course, helps us as trainers to train teachers in effective teaching. As we've seen, I think it's important to just remind ourselves here that the teaching and the learning context provide opportunities for control and opportunities for no control. And if we consider where teaching goes on, and if we consider who is in the teaching, not just the teacher, but also the students, usually, not always, but usually the teacher has very little control over where teaching takes place. I'm sure that teachers cannot normally choose which room they're in or when it actually takes place. They have no control over who the learners are. But what we do have slightly more control over is the what and the how of the teaching. In other words, the activities that we engage our students in and how the learning is actually delivered. So as a trainer, or as a potential trainer, the question then is this: why is it important to start thinking about what language teachers do and how they actually do it? Because these are the things that we all have far more control over. Remember, we have little control over where it happens and who is doing it and who is receiving it. But what we do have some control over is more the what and the how. Now, let's not be extreme. I'm not saying all the time. I'm just saying in a general sense, we have more control over the what and the how. And this is where we can support our teachers. So this gentleman here, who you may recognize, this is Donald Freeman. He talks about defining or trying to define what teachers do and how we do it. And he says this, he says, how we define language teaching will influence to a large extent how we educate people as language teachers. So if we can come up with a definition of language teaching, and then we can then analyze that definition, that's actually going to help us to educate people as language teachers. I think that makes sense. So here's a task for you. Let's define language teaching. So I'm now going to give you 30 seconds, and in those 30 seconds, I'd like you to write your definition of language teaching in the chat box. 30 seconds. Let me see your definitions. Okay, great. I mean, obviously I've asked you a completely, absolutely impossible task, but brilliant that so many of you are putting things in the chat box. Some of you have been very specific. Some of you have mentioned speaking. Others of you have mentioned things in a much broader term about culture, about communication, and so on. And of course, it's an impossible question, and there isn't an answer to it. It's actually very difficult to define what language teaching is. But let's go back to one of our experts and just have a look at what Farrell says in response to the task, let's define language teaching. Farrell says that to date, there's actually no precise benchmarks of what constitutes effective second language teaching, and very importantly, in all settings. Now, of course, if you've done CELTA or an equivalent training course, or maybe this has happened to you internally, your teaching will have been assessed or better evaluated against a set of criteria. So the people within your organization, or indeed Cambridge Assessment, have come up with criteria for CELTA. And these are the benchmarks of what constitutes effective second language teaching, or what is perceived as effective second language teaching. But there's no way that those criteria can apply to all settings. It's very, very context specific. And Farrell goes on to say that indeed there are no agreed effective strategies that teachers should implement in their classes. In other words, there isn't a list, there isn't a restaurant menu of effective strategies that are guaranteed to work in any one particular context. So we're pretty much in a very difficult situation. We're in a dilemma here. But of course, what we can do is go back to the word, or go back to the title on this particular slide. You know, what is it that effective teachers do? Let's have a look at what effective teachers do, because this will help us to understand what it is that we need to be teaching teachers in order to become more effective. So we can look at expert teachers, and again, I just very quickly, if you've got some ideas, what do you think an expert teacher is, or what do you think an expert teacher does? Just very quickly, 30 seconds, put your ideas in the chat box. And we've got already some great ideas: facilitator, inspire, explores, own methods, engagement. Yep. I mean, all of these are obviously great ideas. Again, there's no right or wrong answer to this. It's impossible to say with any degree of accuracy or even confidence of what expert teachers do. But if we look at the research and we throw everything into a box, we probably come up with these particular attributes. First of all, an effective teacher is not just effective, they are highly effective. they're experienced. I don't think you can be an effective teacher if you haven't had experience. The question, of course, is how much experience makes you effective. Is it 2 years, 4 years, 10 years, 20 years? These are unknowns. Maybe an effective teacher has been recommended by other people. In other words, they've received good feedback from other people, maybe from their own students, maybe from their peers, maybe from people who have observed them. Maybe the teacher has won an award for their teaching. Hopefully the teacher will have achieved results, and of course achieving results will vary from context to context. And for me, one of the most important ones, and as I said, this list is not exhaustive, it's not definitive, and if you've thought of other things, please don't feel that they're not also relevant. But I think one of the most important things is that effective teachers are constantly thinking about their students. They're prioritizing student learning above and beyond everything else that goes on. So just keeping with this idea of what effective teachers do, I want to show you this lady. This is Sui, and what she says about expert teachers is that expert teachers are not bothered so much about the routines of what goes on in a classroom, because when something is routine, it's not something that you need to think about too much. It's not something that you need to worry about too much. And if you're not bothered about routines, it means that you can reinvest your time to look at other things, to tackle other problems. So I think, in other words, what she's saying is that expert teachers are always working behind the scenes to improve their teaching, because we're not concerned about the routines of everyday teaching. Now, those of you that are able, think back to your first days as teaching. I can certainly remember my first day. I can't remember the teaching, but what I can remember is the planning. I can remember spending hours and hours and hours and hours worrying over what I was going to do in the classroom the next day, and preparing and teaching one of my friends what I was going to teach in the classroom the next day. My time and my efforts were completely invested in the routine of getting through those, I don't know, was it 45, 50 minutes? I can't remember, but it was certainly a relatively short amount of time that I was actually preparing for. And I probably put in hours and hours and hours of preparation into that one particular lesson. Of course, nowadays, and I'm sure many of you are in the same position, I don't need to invest so much time in the routine, and I can focus more on adding variety, if you like, into my teaching. Now, my friend and colleague Matt, who's not with us today, both of us are football fans. This is not a picture of Matt, it's not a picture of me. This is a picture of somebody whom we both admire greatly, Sir Alex Ferguson. You may remember him as the manager of Manchester United for a long time, and you may be thinking, well, why is he on the screen? Well, he's here because in his autobiography, he wrote this, and I think it's, yeah, I adore him as well. Somebody's saying they adore him. He wrote something which I think is very relevant for us as teachers and trainers, and he said this: so Sir Alex says that a true winner is somebody who's relentless. In other words, they never stop. The very best players, and let's replace player with teacher, they compete against themselves to become as good as they can be. They just have a built-in desire to excel and to improve. So effective teachers are not satisfied with just being effective. They want to be highly effective. And this is something which comes from inside. It's a desire to want to improve. So effective teachers then, remember, while they may have that desire, they're also going to need help in order to build on their experience, in order to become an expert in their field. And I think a question we need to ask ourselves then is the one that Weston and Clay mention, is that we need to be asking ourselves, how can we develop teachers into evaluative practitioners? And I've mentioned already in my talk that we want our teachers to think back. We want our teachers to reflect, and indeed I've asked you yourselves to do this today. I've asked you to reflect on several things. We want our teachers to evaluate themselves as classroom practitioners. And only by doing that can we really come up with some sort of understanding of what an effective teacher actually does. And this brings me into the last part of what I want to talk to you about today, and that's teacher learning. And I want you again to reflect on yourselves as teachers and also yourself as learners, and just ask yourself some questions. Again, you don't need to write in the chat box if it's not necessary, but I do want you to think. So my first question then is, how have you actually learned your teacher knowledge? Where does your teacher knowledge actually come from? And as I say, you don't need to write anything, but please just think to yourselves in response to that question. Where has your teacher knowledge actually come from? And maybe for some of us, it's been very much learning on the job, learning as you do it. Maybe you were thrown in at the deep end. I certainly was. When I first started teaching, I was literally thrown into a classroom with not a clue about what I was supposed to be doing. Hopefully I've improved slightly over the last 40 years. Maybe for others that there was a period of training, a period of studying before teaching in the classroom. So these are things that we need to consider, where we've actually learned, where we've actually got our teaching knowledge from. I think I don't want to linger on the current COVID crisis which we're all going through. I don't know about you, but prior to a month ago, I had actually done very few webinars, and I suddenly had to improve my knowledge about how to do online training with teachers. And assuming that what I knew a month ago would help me for what I'm doing right now, this moment, it was something that had to be done differently. And I very much learned on the job in the last 2 or 3 weeks. I've probably delivered, I don't know, probably about a dozen webinars now in the last 3 to 4 weeks, whereas normally I wouldn't have done a dozen in a year. So I've very much learned on the job. I certainly haven't had time to go through any studying or training before doing any sort of online work. I think we also need to remember that all of us have spent, or all of us did spend, thousands of hours in classrooms as students before we began to learn how to actually teach in the classroom. We observed teachers, our own teachers at primary school and secondary school, at college, and this is what Lorty calls an apprenticeship of observation. And this, of course, creates a very strong sense of teacher behaviors. In other words, we observe the model, we observe the teacher, and we get to understand how teachers actually behave in the classroom. Of course, that doesn't mean that all the teacher behaviors that we observe were positive ones, but many may actually reappear in our own classrooms. But let's think about what we do now. What do we do now to learn more about our profession? What do we do now to learn more about teaching? Now, I'm just checking, and I think we've got just under 3,000 of you in the webinar room at this moment. So at least 3,000 of you are here in response to my question on the screen there. What do you do now to learn more about teaching? Well, you're here. You've signed up for this webinar. So that's a very, very good example of what you actually do in order to learn more about teaching. And I'm coming to the end now, but I want to show you one more footballer. It's interesting that footballers seem to have a lot to say about our profession. I think there are always lots of crossovers between different skills and different professions. Yeah, this is Ronaldinho. And Ronaldinho said, and again, in his autobiography, I think he's too young to have an autobiography, but anyway, he does. And he said this, that often a footballer, and let's change that for teacher, often a teacher doesn't have the time to think too much. It's instinct that gives the orders. And I'm sure many of you are incredibly busy in your jobs as teachers, and it's probably true that you don't have a lot of time to think about what you do. And there's something instinctive that makes you do what it is that you do in the classroom. And it's those instincts, it's those perceptions, it's those understandings of ourselves as teachers that we need to be constantly drawing on. Somebody just mentioned Bill Shankly, who was Liverpool, so I'm not happy with that comment. Let's move on to round up what I want to talk to you about this morning. Let's remember that not all teacher learning revolves around the trainer. In other words, what you learn as teachers doesn't always revolve around somebody talking to you, as I am this morning. And it's very important for us as trainers, and those of you in the room today who want to become a trainer or improve your skills, that we must never patronize our audience. We must never think of our trainee teachers as blank slates, because they're not. Everybody brings something to the context which we're working in the same way that every student brings something into the classroom context. So we need to be asking ourselves the question all the time, where else do teachers actually learn from other than from a trainer? And of course, teachers learn primarily for themselves and from their own experience. The important thing for us as trainers is that we get teachers to reflect on their experiences and to learn from them. Teachers will, of course, learn from their peers, from their colleagues, other teachers, other educators, as we're doing now, but also through reading and through watching YouTube and all of the other resources. But sorry to repeat myself, but I think it's really important that we just reinforce this point, that the best place that teachers learn from is from their own beliefs and their assumptions. And of course, these beliefs and these assumptions will be linked in to a teacher's own actual teaching experience. We're just about out of time, so I want to quickly conclude what I want to say to you today. I think overall, or to summarize, that the trainer's role is very much a balancing act. And what we're trying to do is to help teachers to think about three P's, not Jeremy Harmer's 3 P's, not present, practice and produce, but the personal P, the professional P, and the practical P. Those are the 3 P's that we need trainers to focus on if we want the trainer to help the teacher as much as possible. So the 3 P's are basically, the first one is the personal, and this is what a teacher has. This is the teacher's knowledge and their experiences, and all of those beliefs and assumptions. And these are the real foundations of how people teach. And there's nothing wrong with that. We all need to bring that to the context within which we're working. I'm jumping the second P to take us immediately to the third P, which is the practical. Because as I said, there's a very strong link between the personal and the practical. This is what teachers do. They teach based on their knowledge and their experiences. And as I say, these are the fundamental foundations of what we actually do. But those of you who are in the room now, 2,915 of you, you are the second P. You are the professional P, because you're actively thinking about research and theory and what other practitioners like myself, how does all of that impact on what you already know? So you're building on what you already know. And by putting those first 2 P's together, you will become much, much more effective in the third P, on the practical side. So yes, everybody, no matter what their skill or their profession is, you need the personal side. But what's more important is the professional side. It's what you're doing today that is going to make you a more effective teacher. So my final conclusion is just to say that there's no right or wrong way in what we're doing. There's no good or bad. You know, I need to reinforce that as a trainer, you can never know can never really know what it is the teacher needs. But what we can do is encourage teachers to take risks and to look at change. As I said earlier, nobody likes change, least of all teachers, because the routines and the things which are familiar are the safest ones. But something that I wrote a few years back is that change in the classroom is always going to be difficult. So my advice from trainers to teachers, and teachers to each other, is just to have a go and see what happens, because there may be a lot of very, very pleasant surprises. So that brings me to the end. I've come right up to my 60 minutes. So I apologize if we don't have an enormous lot of time for question and answer, but I don't know, Simbella, if there's anything that anybody wants to ask.
Thank you so much, Peter. What a fantastic session. Thank you all for your comments as well. We've been monitoring them throughout. Peter, you did have quite a few questions come through that I pulled out some of the ones that you might want to just speak to a little bit.
Sure.
One was about, can an amateur not be called effective if they do everything that an effective teacher, as per the presentation, does?
Well, we've introduced another word, which is amateur. So I'm not really sure I know what an amateur is.
I suppose she means a less experienced teacher, because one of the things was experience that we mentioned contributes to a great teacher. So perhaps this is a less experienced teacher.
No, I would never say that an inexperienced teacher cannot deliver an effective lesson. But I think I made the point quite early on that really effective teachers have breadth and depth of knowledge. It's not a criticism to say that an inexperienced teacher doesn't know everything. Indeed, an experienced teacher doesn't know everything, but they know an enormous amount more than an inexperienced teacher knows.
Sure. Thank you for answering that. I hope that helped to the person who answered it. And also, somebody asked for clarity on the word teacher knowledge. So I thought that might be a nice one to kind of round off with.
Yeah, I think by teacher knowledge, it's your knowledge of what we do as teachers. It's what we do as educators. Knowledge can cover language knowledge, knowing what the present perfect tense is. It can be knowing what a particular word means. But it's also knowledge about what works in the classroom. What should I be doing as a teacher? What are the skills and what are the approaches that I need in order to teach an effective lesson?
Fabulous. Thank you for answering that. A lot of questions are coming through about becoming a trainer now.
Sorry guys, Peter and Sambala. I think we have run out of time already.
Raz, I think we could probably do a couple more questions. If people are not able to stay, they can.
If you're
sure.
Let's do a couple more, because it's.
If you're okay to this.
Yeah, if you're okay, Peter, we are fine.
Yeah.
Okay, fabulous. So one of the questions is really, a lot are coming through that are similar to being, is it necessary for a trainer to be an expert teacher? How do we become trainers?
Yeah, I mean, I think, the first question, do you need to be an expert teacher to become a trainer? Then, I mean, obviously, depending on your definition of expert teacher, but as I said, I think if you're moving into becoming a trainer, or you have the aspiration, then you need to know what you're talking about. You don't want to go to a doctor who's not expert. You don't send your car to a mechanic who doesn't know what they're doing. And similarly, if you're going to be training teachers, you need to know. You need to have the depth and the breadth of knowledge, which I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, absolutely. Sarah Al-Rifai has asked, is there a certain book you recommend for new trainers or for teachers in general?
Well, definitely the book that I've quoted, the book that Matt and I are currently working on, which will be published next year, early next year. So definitely that one. But actually, no, one of the reasons for writing the book is that there aren't any books. There is nothing out there at the moment which people can pick up and say, oh, this will help me to become a better trainer. No, there isn't anything, unfortunately. No.
That's great. And then if somebody is dealing with teachers who don't really want to accept new strategies and methods in teaching, this has come up a lot in the comments. Any tips for that?
Yeah, and I think it's quite a common occurrence that teachers are not willing to try something. And it goes back again to something that I mentioned. It's you know, the job of a trainer is not just to show the teachers what. More importantly, it's why. Anybody can dish up, you know, a whole host of activities that teachers can use in the classroom. But, you know, the good trainers will help teachers to understand why they should be doing that activity, the rationale behind it. And any training situation which is introducing something new to teachers should provide them with ample opportunity to reflect on that activity and to think about how they might introduce it into their own teaching.
Great. It's that's probably hit many of the questions on the head, because many of them have asked a similar thing here in the comments and questions. And then I guess winding down, I pulled out some lovely comments that lots of thanks coming from you all. If you're happy to wind
absolutely.
up, Peter.
Yeah.
I really liked Alia Mahrous, who said, what is good with your sessions is that you open the door for thinking and meditating, or meditating perhaps, about our teaching. And thanks for this. And lots are asking for your personal email address.
Well, it's public knowledge, so I don't have a problem with that.
So yeah, you can contact us. Peter's email address is there on the slide, and you can contact us at Cambridge MENA as well at the email address cambridgemena@cambridge.org. And thank you so much for all of your praise and your compliments coming through. They're really wonderful to see, and we're so glad that this has been so useful. And
thank you very much,
very
Sumbala.